Hi, thank you so much for having me. I am thrilled to be here at DC Fintech Week. And as the chair of the Filecoin Foundation, I am especially thrilled to be celebrating the 1-year anniversary of the launch of Filecoin. Now, I know that in Washington, DC, cryptocurrency has become a hot topic in recent months. And today I'd like to talk about how cryptocurrency can be the foundation for a better internet, an alternative to big tech that puts people in control of their own data, protects user privacy and security, and permanently preserves humanity's most important information. Let me explain how. Cryptocurrency makes it possible to send monetary value across the globe instantly and securely, just as easily as you can send information over the internet by attaching a file to an email. That is to say, cryptocurrency does for monetary value what the internet did for information. For me, the most important thing about cryptocurrency is that it creates the ability to program money. In other words, you can write computer code that automatically transfers value upon a condition being met. So for example, you could write a computer program that says, for every second of a song that I play, automatically transfer the equivalent of a millionth of a cent from me to the songwriter. And this can happen instantly and automatically with no intermediary between us, even across borders. This kind of transaction would be completely untenable using traditional payment systems. Now, today, we're celebrating the 1-year anniversary of the launch of Filecoin. Filecoin uses that same programmable money concept to create a decentralized file storage network. If you have extra storage space on your computer hardware, you can rent it out to others who will pay you to store their files or pieces of their files so that only the file owner can put the pieces back together. A computer program will regularly check that the files are still being stored on your computer, and if so, automatically compensate you with cryptocurrency. So you can think of it like Airbnb for file storage. Storage providers are renting out their extra storage space to earn Filecoin, and users are spending Filecoin to store their files on other people's computers. That may sound like a niche use case, but we believe that this could be a foundational technology for the next generation of the internet. So today's internet is centralized. The vast majority of the data making up the many websites that Americans use every day sit in data warehouses owned by just 3 companies: Amazon Web Services, Microsoft Azure, and Google Cloud. We have repeatedly seen these companies suffer blackouts and vast swaths of the web go down for hours, including websites that are massive contributors to the American economy. Facebook's 6-hour outage earlier this month is a prime example. That's the problem with having single points of failure. We believe that you can create a better version of the web if you combine the storage capacity and computing power on all of our individual devices into a supercomputer-like network and store multiple copies of data across those devices. On this decentralized version of the internet, websites will stay up even if some nodes fail, and the availability of information is not dependent on any one server or company. This provides a more robust platform for humanity's most important information. So Filecoin provides the incentive for people to contribute storage to that decentralized internet. And it turns out that these incentives work. So over the past year, 3,300 Filecoin storage providers have contributed nearly 12 exabytes of storage capacity. To put that in perspective, that could store all of the written works of mankind in all languages from the beginning of recorded history to today, more than 10 times over. And that storage space is being used to preserve humanity's most important information. As just one example, the Starling Lab, a project of Stanford and USC, uses the Filecoin network to permanently preserve the USC Shoah Foundation's archive of 55,000 video testimonials of genocide survivors. Filecoin is just one use of cryptocurrency, but it demonstrates how being able to program money to instantly, automatically send microtransactions across the world can create economic incentives that enable entirely new technologies. There are already thousands of projects building other cryptocurrency applications, from automatically paying music royalties to compensating people when their data is used, to paying journalists for each view of an article, to incentivizing consumers to use renewable energy. This technology is really in its early days, and this stage of development for cryptocurrency is often compared to the internet of the early 90s. It would have been a mistake in 1995 to believe that we understood then what the internet would be used for. And similarly, I believe that cryptocurrencies' uses might be just as expansive and that it's vital to ensure that innovation in this space can continue to thrive. Thanks so much, and over to my colleagues at the Filecoin Orbit Lounge.
Much for that, Marta, for that introduction, and I just want to thank everybody who's here in person. We're coming to you live from the Yours Truly Hotel in Washington D.C. We've got a nice sort of studio audience here, I guess. But just want to thank Chris Brummer and everybody at Georgetown Law and DC Fintech Week who made this possible. I want to thank Amplified Event Strategy, PPGAV, especially the hotel here for having us. It's really been a fun time being here, being a part of this event. Nice to be back in person again. So definitely, step in the right direction. So, my name is Stanley. I look after events and community here at the Filecoin Foundation. I just joined recently from CoinDesk, where I was a journalist and an editor and helping to produce events around just kind of the transformation of the financial system. And I'm joined here by an amazing panel. We have Kristin Smith, who is the executive director of the Blockchain Association. And we have Nick Day, who is the managing editor for policy and regulation for CoinDesk. And Nick actually recently just won an award from the Association of Cryptocurrency Journalists and Researchers. I think I'm saying that right. He was the Journalist of the Year. So he's been on the ground for 5 years, just covering this stuff inside and out. There's probably few people who know more than both of these individuals. And certainly last but not least, we have Marta Belcher, who is the chair of the Filecoin Foundation, and she's also general counsel at Protocol Labs. She does like a million other things that don't have time to name them all. But thank you, Marta, for being. We sad you're not here in person with us, but glad to have you remotely here. So maybe I think one of the themes of this conference has really been, of DC Fintech Week, has really been this idea of there's integrity, there's inclusion, and there's integrity, innovation, inclusion. Sorry, and talking about all these areas in the concept of fintech, and I think sometimes there's a bit of misunderstanding around cryptocurrencies and how these fit into these topics, these broader topics that we're trying to address throughout the course of this conference today. So I guess I'm going to tee this up to maybe Kristin. I'll turn to you first. So when we're talking about these topics of innovation, integrity, inclusion, how do you kind of see the role of what role do cryptocurrencies play here? How would you kind of define that from a high level for us?
Yeah, well, so I think cryptocurrency is important not because of necessarily the currency itself, but because of the crypto network that is built around cryptocurrency. And it's like Marta was describing before, it's different storage providers coming together, contributing hardware, running open source software. This is a wonderful innovation. And I think what's great what's great about this is that the going to your themes, there's a tremendous amount of innovation happening, right? Because this is a new infrastructure for financial services, for the internet, for many other areas. And the amount of innovation that needs to happen in order for that to kind of reach its full potential is wonderful. And that's a huge driver of economic activity. And on the inclusion angle, anybody can participate in this. You don't have to work for a specific company. There are multiple different roles that you can play. You can help contribute to the underlying networks. You can help contribute to the software that run them. You can build on top of them. And so there's a tremendous amount of potential here. And I think, sometimes when my day job is working with Congress, we get a lot of pushback that, well, that's not happening today, but it will be happening tomorrow. And I think that's what's super exciting about this space. So yeah, that's all I got.
Yeah, Nick, do you want to add on to that? And maybe even just, I think that's one of the themes of just what we've seen in the last, maybe even just we had a Bitcoin ETF approval, just launching for trading this week even. We can talk a bit more about this later, but I think, if there's one thing to emphasize here, it's just the speed by which these developments we're seeing these progress. And this has gone from being a very niche thing, a niche community, to, it's like kind of eating the world like software 20 years ago, right? So Nick, well, what's your kind of your mental model for viewing this space right now?
Yeah, I think so. To be completely honest, I'm actually, I think, a bit more of a skeptic on a lot of this stuff than many of my colleagues are. But my introduction to adulthood was finding out that my social security number may or may not have been leaked as part of, it was either Experian or one of the other credit providers that lost basically a ton of customer data. And so practically my entire adult life I've had to keep things locked down just in case someone manages to buy my social security and get a credit card in my name or something, and tank my ability to buy a house in a couple of years. And so I think the crypto industry is really, the whole core premise is kind of really asking the right questions about how to protect, consumer data, financial data, how to ensure that you can do the things you want to do in the modern world without having to, live in fear that your data is going to be mishandled by third parties that you have, never been able to opt into, never really been able to have any say over, and never really been able to, even influence to any degree. If you recall, the class action lawsuits against companies like Experian and the like have basically resulted in settlements of promises that they will monitor my, my credit history for the next couple of years. So thank you for sort of solving a problem that you created. I think this is one of the few places where those questions are being asked, and I think this industry is, the fact that there are proposed solutions is really fascinating to me, and that's kind of what I'm looking at is how are these solutions being built, how are they developing, how are they growing, and how is that fitting into this existing world, especially with the regulatory stuff that I cover primarily.
Great. So I'm going to turn over to Marta here with this next question. So with DC Fintech Week this week, we've talked about a whole host of subjects, from CBDCs to payments innovation to cryptocurrencies to like financial integrity, public safety. We've talked about like ESG. We've talked about privacy. This whole just basket of things that kind of fit into this underneath this umbrella, so to speak, of fintech, right? And on the surface, sometimes it kind of looks like these are all kind of individually like siloed areas, right? And it's it's not immediately clear like how these things all kind of like meld together essentially. But I think when we zoom out, we can kind of see that all of these issues are essentially like related to, they're trying to solve some type of problem that exists in the current internet structure. Obviously, there's the internet's done a lot of benefit, has lots of benefits, it's done a lot of positive things for humanity. But there's also been some kind of negative externalities, and there's some issues that are just coming up right now. And I think kind of the exciting thing about cryptocurrency and the innovation that we're seeing is like it really represents a broader kind of sea change in just like we're not just trying to find a new way of exchanging money, like we're trying to find a new way of thinking about how do we use the internet. So or what's the best way to sort of build the internet in a way that works for everybody. So Marta, maybe I'll let you kind of run with that, but maybe walk us through like what this idea of Web3 or decentralized web, or there's a number of names that people are kind of referring to this idea of the evolution of the internet. So how do you sort of help us understand how you view this?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for that question. As Nick was saying, we experience so much of our daily lives through just a handful of large corporations. And we really have no choice but to trust those corporations. We have to trust them not to misuse troves of data about us. That data includes what we do online, who we talk to, what we click on, what we say. We have to trust them to keep that data safe from attackers, and we have to trust them to protect our civil liberties when they're responding to requests from governments. And I think there are all sorts of different proposals for addressing these concerns. But my view is that one answer here is really to look at this centralized architecture and think about what it might mean instead of having this centralized internet to decentralize the web. As I mentioned before, just as an example of what it means to have these single points of failure and the centralized version of the internet. Just so much of today's internet is really just in a few companies' hands. And when we see these companies suffer blackouts, we suddenly realize, why it's a problem to have single points of failure. And so, for us at the Filecoin Foundation, we really think that you can have a much better version of the web if instead of relying on these centralized intermediaries, you can sort of combine a bunch of different people's storage capacity and computing power and create a network where you can store multiple copies of data across those devices. And if you decentralize the web, these websites will stay up even if some nodes fail. And more importantly, the availability of information isn't dependent on one server or one company. So our mission at the Filecoin Foundation is to preserve humanity's most important information. And we really believe that decentralizing the web is the path to providing a more robust platform for humanity's most important information.
Great. And Marta, I think you have an interesting kind of vantage point here, just given kind of your background at on the technology side, on like kind of the crypto side specifically, but then also as a civil liberties attorney, we're working with EFF, Electronic Frontier Foundation, et cetera. And maybe touch a bit on the kind of that crypto Web3 connection. Just given, kind of the broader scope of work that you've done in the past and what motivates you.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I think there are a couple of things, big misconceptions about sort of civil liberties as they relate to cryptocurrency. So I think one of the things I hear a lot is a misconception that tools that can help to empower users and enhance privacy, are bad. But actually, privacy is not bad or illegal. And in fact, the ability to have privacy, and particularly in financial transactions, are really essential to civil liberties, especially for financial transactions. I often talk about pictures that I saw come out of the Hong Kong protests that really drove this point home for me from a civil liberties perspective. So there were these pictures with these long lines at the subway stations as the pro-democracy protesters were waiting to purchase tickets with cash so that their electronic purchases would not place them at the scene of the protest. And so for me, this really underscores that a society where financial transactions are surveilled is really a surveillance society, and it shows the importance of private transactions. And so for me, cryptocurrency is important for civil liberties precisely because it imports the privacy of cash into the online world. And that's a feature, not a bug.
Great, thanks for that. Just turning over to Kristin and Nick here. I'd like you both to kind of react to that and just from kind of what are some of like the policy issues that folks need to kind of wrestle with when we want to obviously preserve civil liberties, we want to promote innovation, but at the same time we don't want to enable the bad guys. We don't want to, there's a number of goals here there's a number of kind of things we're trying to, get right essentially. So Kristin, how are you explaining this to folks like on the Hill or in the administration about these?
There's a series of public policy issues around the cryptocurrency space, and they all sort of stem from this same challenge and that challenge is that we're dealing with a decentralized network where there's not one single party in charge. A lot of our regulation that we have today, whether it be disclosures and securities laws or reporting to the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network for anti-money laundering issues, or the reporting of tax information, all of these issues right now revolve around having a central entity in the middle that has a customer relationship where they have this information or they have inside information that they can report to the government. And I think that the challenge regulators are having, and also Congress, as Congress is now starting to think about these issues, is how can we achieve the same underlying public policy goals, but do it in a way that makes sense for this technology? Because what happened over the summer is there was an expanded definition of broker that was included in this must-pass infrastructure bill that would have required individual software developers, people who are in the storage business, who don't have customers directly, to go and acquire all of the information that is needed for tax reporting. Like, that doesn't make any sense. And so the challenge is when you have these very, very busy lawmakers that, or regulators, it's getting them to look to the future and understand that this is a totally new, different way of organizing economic activity. And we have to think about regulation that makes sense for this new technology.
Nick, do you want to take that?
Yeah, I mean, so my view is, someone who speaks to a lot of folks, including Kristin all the time, who are coming up with, different suggestions and solutions on how to address some of these questions. And, the range has really been from, just letting companies do their thing, letting startups and developers build out these decentralized projects and kind of accept the fact that, anyone can use them, to creating some kind of, super surveillance-y kind of decentralized project where, obviously on the blockchain you can track transactions. So proposals I've seen include, tying identities to wallets and just being able to track everyone who uses them. And I'm not sure, Kristin probably has a better idea than I do. I'm not sure how, whether any of these proposals are really going to gain favor in Congress or amongst regulators, but it does feel like we're just in such an early phase of all of this that whatever kind of middle ground solution ends up kind of succeeding, it's not going to happen for probably quite a while. Definitely not this year, probably not next year. And hopefully by the time we do get actual congressional action and, firm regulatory guidance, maybe there will be some kind of popular, both technologically and policy-wise, solution that's favorable to the concerns about financial surveillance, but also allow policymakers to, enact their goals that, they don't want to allow crimes to happen. They don't want to allow, illicit actors to be able to use these tools. And, that's kind of what they're looking at.
So I think like one of the challenges that folks have in kind of trying to explain, interacting with kind of the Washington policy crowd, and also the challenges the policy crowd has trying to understand what's happening in this industry, is there's just like so much happening and there's so much moving here at light speed, and even for folks who are in the industry every single day, it's like impossible to keep up. But there's so much, from a narrative perspective, there's so many interesting things happening that, on the surface, it may be kind of difficult to see exactly like why this is important or why this is interesting. I think like NFTs or non-fungible tokens are kind of the premier example of this, where people look at these like, why are people paying so much money for these sort of pictures on the internet? And then, but once you kind of start diving in, you realize a bit more of there's the digital scarcity, and there's a whole potential to kind of revolutionize how intellectual property rights are distributed on the internet, and how this can empower creators and communities, et cetera. It kind of like your mind kind of opens up a bit more. And I'd like to kind of just go around the horn here and just ask each of our panelists about, is there a particular like use case that you see in the industry right now that is that you're really intrigued by, that you don't think gets maybe like quite the understanding or the recognition it deserves, whether it be like NFTs or like stable coins, or even kind of this new idea of like play to earn gaming, where people in the Philippines in lockdowns, COVID lockdowns, were playing these blockchain-based games and earning tokens just for playing these games, and then converting that into Philippine pesos, and then using that to like buy food and subside. So there's lots of just like really cool things happening that I don't really think most people really understand very well. So I would like to kind of just go around the horn here. Kristin, you want to start?
Yeah, no, I am super fascinated. I consider this almost its own bucket of innovation, kind of around the creator economy. And part of that is NFTs, but it's also social tokens that are compensating people for different activities and allowing content creators to just find new ways to monetize content. I mean, I think that's really cool, because there aren't a lot of options today. If you're putting videos up on YouTube, you don't have a lot of flexibility there. But now we have this whole world where you can design all of these different models for people to potentially be contribute or compensated for the content they create. But I think what I'm most fascinated by, and I don't actually know a whole lot about it, but is this whole idea of the metaverse, and the fact that if you think about how you spend most of your day, it's not usually in a room in front of a bunch of people, right? We are looking at our screens all day long. I look from this screen to this screen and back and forth, back and forth. We are spending so much of our time interfacing with the digital world that there's probably cooler, better ways to do that. And when we're in the digital world, just like when we're in, the real world, we're going to want to surround ourselves with goods that make us happy, right? Like we are going to want art that is unique and special to us. We are going to want to, have a version of a digital Rolex or something, right? I mean, you want to signal who you are and something about your personality to the world. And the more we're in these like online universes, there's going to be an entire economy, and it's not unrealistic that at some point we'll be spending more on goods for our virtual lives than in our like actual physical worlds. And so I think that's just like a super cool idea, and one that I'm personally very fascinated by.
What you, Nick?
I think for me, an idea that I've heard discussed for quite a few years, but I'm not sure where it's actually built, where it's actually at in terms of being built. But this idea of digital and decentralized ID, where you're able to you have your own digital profile that you're in control of, and you can decide, which parties get access to which aspects of it. So if you're applying to get a new credit card, you can give them, give the bureau or the issuer the appropriate information that they need. So your credit history, your KYC information, versus if you want to maybe apply for a job, you can give them access to your academic records and to your past job history. But just this idea of having all of that in some kind of single unit, whether that's on your phone or your phone's making no sense, but maybe on a laptop. But being able to control that, being able to tie, not need to have like a separate passport, a driver's license, a credit card, different cards and different devices for different places you go to. That's been really fascinating to me, and it does kind of feel like this futuristic thing. I don't know how many people here watch The Expanse, but they have something kind of like that in the show. There we go. Where, they have like these screens, and a lot of what they need is just kind of through the single device. And I'm looking forward to seeing if that gets built and if that gets adopted, because right now, people who fly, they have to either have a passport or maybe they need a real ID if their driver's license doesn't qualify as visual identification. So it's just a lot, and there's a lot of potential rooms for failure there. And again, this ties back to my earlier question about being able to control your own data.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting one that I think a lot of people can relate to. And I always kind of go back to this analogy of if I'm going to like a bar, right, and the bouncer at the door asks for my ID to verify that I'm 21, like he doesn't need to know my name or like where I live or like any of this other personal information. He just needs to know that I'm actually 21 years old. So it's like, you don't necessarily need to, if there's ways that we can just selectively disclose the information that's relevant without, just giving just dumping all this information on the web or just making this easily available. I mean, I think there's like a real or even with like kind of like Google sign on and things of that nature. It's like, okay, I want to sign into this website. I don't necessarily want to sign with my Gmail. I don't want these people like know everything about me in my Gmail account, right? Or my Facebook account or whatever. So I think that's a really intriguing use case that there's a lot of people working on it, but I'm curious to, excited to see when that finally kind of picks up more steam. So Marta, let's turn it over to you. Which use case, other than decentralized storage, are you most excited about?
Thanks. There's an economist in Peru named Hernando de Soto, and he coined a term, dead capital. And dead capital refers to property that is sort of informally held. It's not legally recognized. And so it can't be exchanged for financial capital. So because there isn't this certainty of ownership, the asset, you can't borrow against that asset. So this is dead capital. And the idea is that a lot of people, there's all this sort of dead capital all around the world. And for me, this concept is really interesting when you think about cryptocurrency, because the most important thing for me about cryptocurrency is that it creates the ability to write programs for your money, that you can write computer code that will automatically transfer value. And this ability to program your money, I think, really opens the door for all sorts of for monetizing all sorts of things that we would never have thought we could have monetized before. So the ability to send transactions across the world, instantly in, 1/1,000,000th of a cent increments is really powerful. So the example I often use is like music royalties, like being able to program your money to say, for every second of a song I play, automatically transfer 1/1,000,000th of a cent to the songwriter, right? And the thing that I think is so interesting about that is that using the ability to program your money, you can create all sorts of economies that just didn't exist before, that just were completely impossible. So for example, Wikipedia was built with a lot of free labor, right? But you can easily now with cryptocurrency technology build a Wikipedia, and there are plenty of projects that use a similar concept where you're for every 5 seconds that someone is viewing a particular article, the person who wrote it is getting compensated. Or if the thing that you wrote, is verified by 5 other people, you're getting compensated for it. And so I think we're just scratching the surface with what the ability to program money can do and the kinds of dead capital that it can unlock.
Yeah, interesting. That's a really. I remember I read that book in grad school, the Mystery of Capital, and it was, it's really it's always been one of the intriguing things of this industry is like, how can we kind of tap into that potential? It's just sitting there, right? And I mean, and even kind of going back to like the core themes of the conference here that we've been talking about, like integrity, innovation, inclusion. I think from a narrative perspective, I think when a lot of people from the outside look at this industry, they see just like there's a lot of kind of like, just to be honest, there's kind of like some crazy stuff that's sort of there's certain Silicon Valley personalities that go on Twitter and Saturday Night Live promoting their preferred coin. There's people spending like millions of dollars on these kind of digital NFT pictures on the internet, and like there's just some like crazy stuff, right? So like, I think it kind of begs the question, like, what does any of this stuff have to do with like integrity, innovation, and inclusion? And where does, what's kind of like the bigger picture here, I guess? I guess I'll pose that to anyone who wants to take that one. Kristin, you want to take that?
Yeah, well, I think to the integrity point, the reason Bitcoin was created was coming out of a financial crisis, right? And there were flaws that were identified that Bitcoin in a way helped address. And I think if we look at something like the Filecoin network or other networks that are being laying the foundation to build Web 3.0, they're trying to address flaws with Web 2.0, right? And so I think that the crypto networks are a way to restore integrity to these very essential services that we all have come to rely on in our lives. And so I think, if you look back to the .com days, there were all sorts of kind of crazy things that happened then, and amazing IPOs with companies that weren't worth anything, and you had people sort of come and go. I think anytime you have anything new, it does attract a certain type of personality. But the people I work with every day in the member companies of the Blockchain Association, these are really hardworking people that are trying to come in and make the world a better place. And I think that makes it very exciting. And yes, there's going to be some, sort of interesting, entertaining headlines in the early days, but that it's going to settle out over time as we get a little bit further down the road and these networks become more integrated, and more services are built on top of them that become integrated into our lives.
Great. I'd like to kind of switch gears slightly here and focus a bit more on kind of like the DC and the policy angle. And we've got 3 guests here who have really done a great job or kind of at the forefront of trying to translate this industry and some of the technicalities and some of the potential and the craziness that we see, and trying to kind of translate this to the DC audience really. And I was here in 2017 and 18 as a reporter for CoinDesk covering crypto. I think I might even been the first crypto reporter here in DC. I'm not sure, but I was, I just remember kind of at that time, it was like everyone kind of had these questions and we need some more education. And, I come back to DC and, today, and it's there's some areas where wow, we've made a lot of progress. And there's some areas where it's okay, we haven't really changed the narrative much. I mean, maybe Nick, I'll turn to you. I mean, you've been covering kind of the regulatory beat, pretty much day in, day out for the last 3-4 years now. What do you kind of see, like how do you see kind of the industry's like evolution in its relationship with the Washington crowd?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really growing for sure. If we're talking like flash versus substance, way back, 2-3 years ago, there was a lot of, I think quiet conversations, but regulators weren't, they were engaging, but the kind of engagement was really focused on, very specific issues. It wasn't, we didn't have conversations about stablecoins the way we're having right now. Conversations about securities and ICOs were mainly, RDs violating the law. Now there are so many companies and so many groups that are actually trying to engage with lawmakers, and we're seeing lawmakers, I think, engage more and more now than they were a couple of years ago. Regulators have been, I think, engaged for years now, but even that's kind of ramping up. We're seeing, we're going from conversations to, we're going to see a report from the Fed about central bank digital currencies. We're going to see a separate report, I think, from the Fed about stablecoins. We're going to see the President's Working Group report on stablecoins. We're going to see, action from the SEC, I imagine, pretty soon. But they just allowed Bitcoin futures ETF to start trading, and we're going to have another one start next week. We're seeing, more and more applications for different kinds of novel crypto products, whether that's, Ether futures ETFs and Ether spot ETFs or margined crypto future products. It's really kind of ramping up. And I think we are seeing a maturation of how crypto industry is approaching a lot of these regulators and lawmakers. We're still seeing for sure a lot of flash. There's a lot of, if you go on Twitter, there's a lot of angry tweets about, how certain politicians or certain regulators are criminals who are bent on destroying the industry or, stuff like that. And I think, we're starting to see more and more that regulators are just filtering that out and looking at the people who are actually engaging, people like Kristin and the rest of the Blockchain Association folks here and some of the other trade organizations that are, working with their groups to engage in a way that isn't just name calling and, whatever, but actually get some substantive reactions and comments and thoughtful feedback in. And I think we're starting to see a lot of warm reception to that. In particular, the OCC, for just one example, under 2 different acting controllers, we're seeing pretty warm feedback, advice to the crypto industry, but they're not out here saying, stablecoins are clearly banks, we're going to shut them all down. They're engaging, they're talking to people and they're talking to companies and saying, all right, well, show us what you got and we'll tell you what we have concerns with and, let's work from there.
Yeah, and I think, the presence of like really kind of forward-thinking regulators, Chris Giancarlo, whom we heard from earlier, make sure you buy his book. Yeah. And then, even like Brian Brooks, who was sort of, like a bull in a china shop during his tenure at the OCC. And I think there's just been like a real like maturation. I mean, I think even the former head of FinCEN came over from Chainalysis. There's just like the knowledge has really just percolated to the top, I think. Kristin, give us kind of, Blockchain Association's been around for 3 years now, right? So congratulations on that. But how has things evolved since you first started out in this ambitious?
It's going like this. It's great. For the longest time, there just simply weren't enough people working on public policy issues that understood crypto in Washington. And that has completely changed in the past couple of months. We see different organizations that are investing in bringing policy people onto their team and working with lobbyists. We see new groups popping up that are focusing on education around DeFi, like the DeFi Education Fund, around Web 3.0. The Filecoin Foundation is doing events in Washington, DC. All of this is really important because these, the information just doesn't pop into a policymaker's head, right? Like there's a whole process for influencing and educating that needs to take place. I also think what's changed is, and this I think is crypto's political superpower, is that policymakers now realize that it's not just a little industry asking for something. It's actually nearly 50 million people across the United States that are investing in cryptocurrencies. And you can't undo that, right? I mean, every single Uber
what was
driver.
the lesson learned from the infrastructure bill?
The lesson learned from the infrastructure bill was, I have voters that care about this. I better check before I put something into a last-minute bill.
Is there another issue where a member of Congress might receive like 50,000 people tweeting at them?
What happened during infrastructure? There were 40,000 things to Fight for the Future. They're an amazing organization. There were 40,000 phone calls that went into the U.S. Senate in the course of about 5 days, and the phones are ringing off the hook. Twitter was going off the hook. And part of that is because the people who are investing in crypto, who are helping build on top of crypto networks, they're a very communicative group of people. They are on Reddit, they are on Twitter, they share information very quickly, and they mobilized in a way that I certainly didn't even imagine that was gonna happen. And so now that that's out there, it was like Nick said, like they're not trying to totally get rid of stablecoins. They're trying to figure out what is the right regulation we can put in place to make sure that the consumers are protected. And so I think we've really turned a corner. I think in 6 months, 12 months from now, we'll actually have a full team, not just the Blockchain Association, but across Washington. We will be a mature industry that is having a smart, strategic, coordinated lobbying effort. And I used to worry that wasn't going to happen, but it's happening now. And there's going to be, some policymakers that come up with crazy ideas, and there'll be ups and downs, and there's never-ending education to do. But at the end of the day, I think we're going to be fine because we have that infrastructure in place, and we can influence and have a seat at the table for when policy discussions are happening.
Yeah, it really kind of comes down to just a question of narratives almost at the end of the day. And I want to turn over to Marta here. Obviously, the industry's been around now in Washington for 5-6 years, longer than that in some cases. But it still just feels like there's a lot of misconceptions floating around. And, I'd just like to turn to Marta, like from your vantage point, what are some of the big issues that, folks seem to just, they can't wrap their heads around, or they're kind of getting stuck on?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, first of all, Kristin's doing, and the Blockchain Association are doing just an incredible job of really clearing up these misconceptions. But I think a couple of them that come up repeatedly. One is, I think there's a common misconception that cryptocurrencies are unregulated, that it's the Wild West. But the on-ramps and off-ramps where people are buying or selling and custodying cryptocurrencies are heavily regulated. These are chartered banks or trust companies or state licensed money transmitters, and they have minimum capital requirements. They have to post bonds, and they open their doors to yearly examinations. They are financial institutions under the Bank Secrecy Act, and so they're registering with FinCEN, they're doing KYC, and they're sharing the details of suspicious transactions. And so I think that's something that isn't well understood. I also think there's a myth about sort of fraud and consumer protection in the cryptocurrency space. I think the fundamental thing for people to understand here is that if someone is committing fraud, it doesn't matter whether they're committing fraud using cryptocurrency or email or the phone or pen and paper. The actions can be taken by the CFPB, the FTC, the CFTC, in addition to private causes of action, regardless of the technology. So in other words, we can and already do sensibly apply existing laws and regulations in the cryptocurrency space. I think another one that comes up repeatedly, is just thinking through how we should think about cryptocurrency's environmental impact. And I think it's really important to understand that different cryptocurrencies have different proof systems and use different amounts of energy. And really, when we built the first computer, it was the size of an entire room, right? But over time, technology gets more scalable and sustainable. And we have seen major cryptocurrencies switch over to less energy intensive proof systems. So like Ethereum's recent move to proof of stake. And I think there's also an important point here that the energy here is often being used to achieve particular societal benefits. So certainly more to be done in that space, but I think important to put it in context.
Great, thanks for that. I want to turn back to Nick here and just touch on some of the recent news that we've had in the last couple of days. I mean, we obviously had a Bitcoin, not a true Bitcoin ETF, like a Bitcoin futures ETF that launched for trading yesterday. And from what I understand, it did pretty well. So could you kind of just help us frame, and obviously we just hit like a new all-time high for Bitcoin now, kind of on the heels of that. So could you kind of just help put in context like what's been going on here, and I think even kind of distinguish between what the differences between like a spot Bitcoin ETF and a Bitcoin futures ETF?
Yeah, well, so Bitcoin futures ETF is tracking the price of CME's Bitcoin futures product, not the actual underlying Bitcoin itself. That's what a spot ETF would track. And SEC Chair Gary Gensler has said a couple times now that he's comfortable with the investor protection provisions that are included in the law that governs futures ETFs more so than he is comfortable with the law that governs spot ETFs. So the first Bitcoin spot ETF began trading yesterday. That was ProShares. It I think had like $1 billion in transaction volume the first day, which was pretty big, and then it's already done $1 billion in transaction volume today, which I think makes it one of the largest ETF debuts in U.S. history. And I'm not sure like what the actual rank is. It's not number one, but it's somewhere in the top 5. It's also the first one to handle $2 billion worth of transactions in 2 days. Apparently gold took 3 days. So clearly there's a lot of demand. The next Bitcoin futures ETF to launch will probably be Van Eck. They're going to go live on Monday. They filed their post-effective amended prospectus this morning saying that, basically hinting that they've got SEC approval. So we'll see how that does, but clearly there's a huge amount of demand. And, I don't know how a Bitcoin spot ETF is going to do. We may see one next year. There's kind of a small betting pool on the fourth quarter of 2022 right now, but I think that's going to depend on whether or not anything changes with the market, but also how can investors or how can companies and issuers demonstrate they want to protect investors in the over the time period it takes to launch this product. The other side of that is, I think I was talking to someone and they said that Bitcoin futures returns over the course of a year might be a little bit less than the returns if you were investing in the actual Bitcoin. So there is, despite the investor protection, provisions, there's also a possibility that by allowing a futures ETF, as any retail investors are actually going to do a little bit less well than if they had invested in a spot product, over that same time period.
Yeah, so it's interesting because we've been waiting. I think the Winklevoss twins first filed a Bitcoin ETF application in like 2013.
Yeah.
It's been sort of 8 years of just like rejection. And I remember when I was reporting on this back, a few years ago, I would, there'd be like one rejection, another rejection. I would be emailing sources like, hey, do you have any new comments on this rejection? And they're like, they just like copy and paste the same thing they sent me 2 years ago. Because like nothing really changed. It was just the same, kind of boilerplate rejections over and over again. And I'd like, Kristin and then Marta, I'd like for both of you to kind of take us out with like, what does this mean for kind of the maturation of the industry? I mean, I think, Bitcoin, there's some people that argue like maybe Bitcoin futures ETF isn't as good as like a spot Bitcoin ETF. But obviously it is a sign of legitimacy and the market, the prices seem to be reacting to that. But like, what does this kind of just mean for the overall maturation of the industry here?
I mean, yeah, it's certainly a monumental moment. It's a big deal and something that should be applauded. I do think, though, that if it's good enough for futures, it's good enough for spot. Because yes, the futures markets are regulated, but the future is based off of the underlying price. And so the arguments that futures are more regulated than spot, I don't think carry through. And I'm hopeful that the SEC will quickly move to do a spot ETF as well.
Great. And then Marta, you want to kind of take us out? Like, what does this sort of mean for the broader, kind of tie a bow on our conversation here today? What does this kind of mean for the maturation of this space as a whole here?
Well, I'll be honest. For me, the least interesting thing about cryptocurrency is the price. So for me, the thing that I'm focusing on and thinking about is really what this technology can do for the future of the web. So while I think it is a great moment for maturation of the industry, it is less interesting for me than thinking about that than it is thinking about the technology itself.
Great. Well, that's all the time we have for today. I just want to thank everyone for being here in person. I want to thank everybody for watching online. Special thanks to Chris Brummer and the DC Fintech Week, Georgetown Law Team for putting this all together, for allowing us to be a part of this. And hope you enjoy the rest of the event.